So question one, how many years does each day in creation represent? And then also, along with that, we talked about this earlier, can you give us just your estimation of how old, number one, the earth, but then also humanity has been around?
Okay, I think you all heard that question. How old is the earth? It's 5.446 billion years, plus or minus 0.0001. We know it to 5 places decimal, and there's many reasons why we know it so accurately. The date for humanity would be somewhere during the last ice age. Genesis 2 states that 4 rivers come together in the Garden of Eden. Those rivers are all named. Genesis 2 tells us where they flow from, and the only place they all come together is now 250 feet below sea level, in the middle of the Persian Gulf. But during the last ice age, that was dry land. And so God created Adam and Eve sometime during the last ice age. You say, what's the date range for that? 15,000 to 130,000 years ago. You say, do we have a more accurate date than that? Well, a scientific date based on DNA is that humans were originated 150,000 years ago, plus or minus 150,000 years. So the biblical date is actually more accurate than the scientific date. And if you want the details, we describe it in our book, Who Was Adam? But I would actually say that Adam and Eve were probably created earlier in that ice age period, because Noah also is an ice age event, because of how long it took the waters to recede, described in Genesis chapter 8. But the first part of the question is, how long are each of the days of creation in Genesis 1? Now, if you look at the grammatical structure of the text, these days are long time periods and they're consecutive. So there's not gaps between the days, and the days don't overlap. They're consecutive days. But there's nothing in the Hebrew grammar or the definition for yom that would insist that they would be equal periods of time. And the scientific record tells us that the days get shorter as you go from day 1 to day 6. So the longest day is day 1, the shortest day is day 6. And you say, well, how long is the shortest day? About 50 million years. How long is the longest day? Nearly 1 billion years. But the whole sequence is about 3.8 billion years.
Okay. Here's a question concerning when you spoke about climate. If we are designed for more warm climate than cold climate, why did God do that? Why not create us to be more apt to both climates?
Well, okay, the question is, why didn't he design us right off the bat to be able to live in all climate zones? Well, every species of life has a temperature range in which it can thrive. The reason we human beings are not constrained by that is we're able to use our technology to design clothing. And so when you go to a sports store, you can buy clothing that has very good perspiration capability, others that are designed to keep you really warm. The fact that we're able to design all this clothing is what enables us to be able to thrive in all these different climate zones. So yeah, if God made us so that we could do really well in a cold climate by giving us lots of fat, making us kind of like a big round ball with short limbs, we would not be able to handle a hot climate. You've got to be able to release heat efficiently. The other thing that makes it difficult for us to be able to survive in a wide climate range is the size of our brains. Okay, the human brain is as big as the laws of physics will permit. Now that might disturb your enjoyment for certain science fiction stories, but yeah, the human brain is at the very top of what the laws of physics will permit. And so the strain for human beings is be able to keep our brain cool enough that it doesn't kill our brain cells. 35% of your blood flow supports your brain. So here's just 3 pounds of your body. It absorbs more than 1/3 of all your blood flow. That's because of everything the brain is doing, but it's also designed to try to keep it cool enough that it doesn't cook itself to death. And so that's why you have to have a sophisticated range of clothing in order to be able to keep your body functioning. Keep in mind, too, God designed our bodies to last for 80 to 100 years. And this, again, requires a particular design of our body. And so I think God did the right thing. He made us bipedal, which means very little sunlight falls on our body. He made us slim, which means we can radiate heat efficiently. He gave us we got the best perspiration system of any animal on the planet that allows us to keep our bodies cool in the space of heat. And he knew that with our technology, we could easily go the other way. You can't go from being able to handle a cold climate to a hot climate, but you can go from being able to a hot climate to a cold climate simply through the use of clothing.
Speak to us about climate change and then also your thoughts on the end times as it relates to the condition of the world plus the prediction of the end of the world as we see in the Bible.
Okay, that's all covered in the book Improbable Planet, and it is out there at the table. It's in chapter 15. So you might want to just jump straight to chapter 15 because it'll tell you all about the ice age cycle and how it is we live on a planet where the ice cycles from 10% to 23%. And I explain in that book why that's crucial to be able to have billions of people on the planet at one time. And the only time that the Earth has had an ice age cycle is for the last 0.00057 part of its history. We've had ice ages before, but never an ice age cycle. This is the only time. Now, what drives that ice age cycle are variations in the orbit of the Earth and the tilt of our rotation axis. And we've been able to document 7 different cycles of the variation of the Earth's orbit and its rotation axis tilt. And typically what these 7+ different cycles do is they lead to temperature chaos, extreme climate instability. So we've had an ice age cycle for 2.6 million years. For all except the last 9,000 years, the global mean temperature has been jumping up and down by 24 degrees Fahrenheit on time scales of 2 or 3 centuries. That kind of temperature variation makes it impossible to engage in large-scale agriculture. And without large-scale agriculture, you can't support 1 billion+ human beings. Without large-scale agriculture, you can't set the majority of your population free to do engineering, art, and science and music. During the last ice age, the whole population was engaged in coming up with enough food, and everything was on a small scale. But for the last 9,000 years, we've had extreme climate stability, where the global mean temperature hasn't changed by more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit over those past 9,000 years. And I wrote the book Improbable Planet to make the point, rather than taking for granted our climate stability, we need to realize it's a miraculous gift from God. We wouldn't have that if God hadn't caused all these cycles to perfectly come into sync. But as an astronomer, I can tell you, it can't last forever. At best, we can sustain the climate stability for about another 1,300 to 1,400 years. Now, if you're premillennial, as I am in my end times eschatology, you have to subtract 1,000 years, because the Lord reigns on the earth for 1,000 years, which means we only got 300 or 400 years left. Now, that's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view would say that climate stability will end in 100 years or less. So 100 years is the worst case scenario, best case scenario, about 1,400 years. And I would also say that the book of Job encourages us to do everything we can to maintain the planet in the condition that God gave us it. And so I'm a firm proponent of saying, yes, as Christians, we should work for climate stability. However, I just did a major critique of Al Gore's book about a sequel to An Inconvenient Truth, making the point that he's making the same mistake he did in his original An Inconvenient Truth. It's the inconvenience problem that's an issue. He's not taking into account that human beings are sinners, because what he's calling for is a huge political movement to force people to give up their economic well-being to stabilize the climate. The problem is most people don't want to give up their economic well-being. And if we Americans do it, the rest of the world's not going to follow suit. And so it's going to collapse. But you can get the book Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, where I basically make the point. Genesis 1 gives us a command: manage the planet for the benefit of all life. But it doesn't tell us how. Job 37, 38, and 39 tell you how to do that. And what you see in the book of Job, it gives us 3 pieces of counsel on how to do the ecologically beneficial thing for all life and at the same time boost our economy. So my critique of Al Gore, he's calling for economic sacrifice. The book of Job says, here's some things you can do that will actually increase your economic well-being. I mean, if you put more money in everybody's pocket, put a higher quality of food in everybody's plate, and at the same time stabilize the climate, who's not going to vote for it? Everybody's going to want it. And so that was one reason why I wrote Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, and the sequel, Improbable Planet, is basically saying God has designed our planet and its life in such a way that when we face an ecological crisis, in advance he's provided us with solutions that are ethically optimal and at the same time economically optimal. Those are the solutions we need to seek. And hey, they're in the oldest book of the Bible.
Wow. I'm still thinking on your, I'm sitting here reeling on, so you're saying optimistically, how long again?
1,400 years.
1,400, yet more realistically, or is it a pessimistic view, or realistically about how long? 100 years.
Well, I would say the 100-year scenario is more realistic if we're really intent on forcing people to make these economic sacrifices. Because basically when we do that, it makes things worse, not better.
And this isn't because you're taking into effect biblical prophecy. You're saying this is scientific agreement in the scientific community.
Just looking at the orbital variations of the Earth, there's no way you can put it off more than 1,400 years. That would be a real stretch.
Earlier over dinner, we were talking about natural disasters, and you made some real key comments just about the natural progression, or just the natural disasters and how the Lord uses them even in very specific purposes. Can you talk a little bit on that? I mean, we've seen Harvey, we have
Sure.
Another hurricane getting hit Florida right now.
Well, the book is not here, but it's more than a theory, where I devote a chapter to explaining how everything we refer to as a natural disaster or an act of God is actually optimally designed to be maximally beneficial for us human beings. So, for example, we have the optimal number and intensity of earthquakes, with the optimal number and intensity of forest and grass fires, and with the optimal number and intensity of hurricanes. And you can go on down the list. Everything is optimized in the context of a universe with gravity, thermodynamics, and electromagnetism. Now, I'll just take time to give you a little hint at what's so good about living on a planet with hurricanes. Okay, what if we didn't have hurricanes like Irma? Hurricanes act like as a thermostat. And so when the ocean water gets really warm, it causes a lot of evaporation, which generates this circulation and causes the hurricane to move. If that wasn't happening, the tropical ocean waters would reach such a high temperature, it would kill all the fish and the algae in the oceans. And that would be devastating to the whole world. So because what tornadoes, or pardon me, hurricanes do, they form over open, warm tropical waters, and they move north. So they take the heat of that tropical ocean water and basically dump it on the continental land masses that are towards the north, which actually makes our continental land areas warmer than they'd otherwise would be, which is a good thing. Some other benefits you get is that they dump rain in places that otherwise would not get adequate rain. Now, I know you're thinking about Houston. They got a lot of rain in a very short period of time. But let me take you to India and China, especially India. The people in India realize if it wasn't for typhoons, and typhoons are hurricanes, just another word for hurricane. If it wasn't for regular typhoons, they call it a typhoon season, the typhoon season, which is enabling them to feed 1 billion plus people. Because thanks to the water delivery from the typhoons, they're able to grow an abundance of food on the Indian subcontinent. So the people in India are much more grateful for hurricanes than we are here in the United States, because they're trying to feed a much larger population. Some other benefits we get from hurricanes is they dump a lot of chlorophyll on the shores of the continents, which is actually a major contribution to sustaining the ecosystem that lives at the seashores. And if you want more, get more than a theory, I kind of document all the benefits we get from hurricanes to a sufficient degree that when you have dinner tomorrow night, you're going to want to thank God for hurricanes. And the other thing I point out is that we have exactly the right number and the intensity. And incidentally, the hurricanes we're seeing today are kind of normative. Yeah, we're getting a couple of big ones, but if you look at it over several centuries, what we're seeing going on here in North America is not out of the norm. You expect to get hurricane seasons like this once in a while.
Shift gears on you. What's the explanation for the lifespan of humans being so many that we read in the early testimony of Scripture, and then all of a sudden now down to 70, 80 by strength?
Sure. Well, the book is out there. It's called Navigating Genesis. And there's a chapter in there explaining why it is that people in the days before Noah could live to be 800 or 900 years. And what I document in Navigating Genesis is that humanity did not become global until the scattering of the nations after the flood. You see that in the Table of Nations, Genesis chapter 10. Genesis 11 talks about how people persisted in rebelling against God by living in one place only. God's intent was that we would become global, but humanity was resolute in saying, we're going to build a city and a tower so we will not be scattered over the face of the earth. And notice God had to forcibly scatter humanity over the face of the earth. What was the rest of that question?
Just the explanation of the long lifespan,
long lifespan.
And then Psalm
Okay.
90, the 70, 80 by strength.
Okay. If you got humanity living in sedimentary plains, that means they're going to be isolated from igneous rocks. Igneous rocks are loaded with uranium and thorium, and the decay of that uranium and thorium works to shorten your lifespan. Now, every human being on planet Earth today is exposed to igneous rocks. Every time you drive a freeway, you're exposed to igneous rocks. Every time you get close to concrete, you're exposed to igneous rocks. But in the days of Noah and Adam and Eve, humanity was living in such a way where they're not exploiting those rocks for civilization. So they were protected from that. But what I document in Navigating Genesis is a discovery by two astronomers, a British astronomer, Wolfendale, and a Russian astronomer, Ehrlichman. And they've been working for 35 years now and have been documenting how there's one supernova explosion that's responsible for over 95% of the killer cosmic rays we experience. And they've been able to show that that supernova exploded less than 100,000 years ago and exploded close to us. In fact, they've even identified the remnant of that supernova eruption. The remnant is 25 degrees across in the sky, which tells us it was really close to us. Now, here's a scenario. In the days before Noah, that supernova hadn't yet exploded, and so humanity was not exposed to those deadly cosmic rays. Whereas after that time, they were, and we still are, exposed to those deadly cosmic rays. And so take away the cosmic rays, take away the igneous rocks, and you can easily have people live 800 or 900 years. But given the cosmic rays and the igneous rocks, nobody's going to make it much past 120 years, as it says in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. But what I also document in Navigating Genesis, we humans today have the longest average lifespan. When you look at the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11, it's mentioning the very few individuals that did not get murdered by their fellow man. And so they were the lucky ones that died of natural causes. They lived to be 800 or 900. but the average lifespan was more like 30 or 40 years because murder was totally out of control. Just to explain the lack of archaeological evidence for people living before the days of Noah means that the human population had to be really low. And given their capability for reproduction at that time, living 800 or 900 years, it means that the murder rate had to be above 95%, which means 95% of all human beings had their life terminated by being murdered by their fellow man, which gives you some reason why God had to intervene with this flood. Humanity was in danger of self-extermination, and so he delivered humanity from wiping themselves out. And you can read about the propensity for murder in Genesis chapter 6. This is particularly evident in the original Hebrew.
This question reads, what about the errors in radiometric dating? The possibility that God created the fossils also, the lack of dust on the moon, why the center of the moon and Earth are still extremely hot after billions of years, etc.
Okay, let me see if I can pick those up one at a time. All this is covered in my book, A Matter of Days, and I checked it's out there. So you can get all the details and the documentation in that. The first one was radiometric.
What about the errors in radiometric dating?
Okay.
I don't even know what that means, so explain that to me.
Well, I think it's chapter 13 in A Matter of Days. There's a whole chapter on radiometric dating. First of all, I make the point, each radiometric tool has a range where it gives reliable dates. And it's basically anywhere from a factor of 6 of the half-life. So when they say that carbon-14 gives an unreliable date, it will give an unreliable date for anything younger than about 1,400 years, or anything older than about 40,000 years. So from 1,400 years to 40,000 years, it will give you reliable dates. Beyond that, it won't. And also there's been critique that uranium dating gives errors. Well, it will give errors if you're dating something less than 1 billion years. The half-life of uranium-238 is 4.41 billion years. So it's great for something that's between, say, 1 billion years and about 30 billion years. That's where it's going to give you reliable dates. But if you're trying to date a Bible manuscript with uranium-238, you're going to get an absurd date. It's way outside the range. The other point is you only get a reliable date with radiometric dating if the sample is pure. And so there have been people who critique radiometric dating by saying, look, there's this Greek urn that gives 3 different dates. Well, it's because the Greek urn is papyrus, which is going to give you 1 date. There's a limestone crust on the papyrus, which formed later, which is going to give you a different date. And then you get an average of the 2, which is going to give you a 3rd date. But each of those 3 dates is accurate if you make sure you're looking at the pure component of the sample. Anyway, I describe all this in A Matter of Days. And really, people who are trying to dispute the radiometric dates, all of them claim that at the time of Noah or at the time of Adam's sin, or both, the radiometric decay rates were accelerated by a factor of 1 million to 1 billion times. But that conclusion contradicts what the Bible states. The Bible states in 7 different places the laws that God established for the universe do not change. Particularly Jeremiah 33, where God says of the Jews, you're changing your mind all the time. I'm God, I don't change. As proof that I don't change, look at the laws that govern the heavens and the earth. As they are changeless, so am I changeless. And as an astronomer, I can tell you, we can directly measure the laws of physics in stars and galaxies, where we're measuring them as they were in the past, and they're the same as they are today, to better than 16 places the decimal. There is no change in the laws of physics, which means there is no change in the radiometric decay rates, which means they really do give us reliable dates. And one of the ways I've found of persuading people of this is the ice cores in Antarctica, because those ice cores have layers that are laid down every year, and in those layers we can see the dust signatures of volcanic eruptions that happen in recorded history, which proves that the layers are annual. But in those layers, we also see radiometric decay products. And by looking over hundreds of thousands of these annual ice layers, we can demonstrate that indeed the radiometric decay rates are reliable in the dates that they give. And then, was there more to the question, or was that it?
Did you answer the fact of the
about
heat?
the moon?
The heat and the moon and the Earth's core.
Okay. Yeah, the other one he was mentioning was about the dust on the moon. Just to be fair, young Earth creationists now recognize this is a very bad argument. But it was an argument that was popular 10 and 20 years ago, where they said, we can measure the amount of cosmic dust falling on the Earth, and if that was to go on for 4 billion years, there would be 200 to 300 feet of dust on the moon, and when the astronauts landed, they only found 60 millimeters. Well, as I point out in a matter of days, if you actually read the paper they were citing, it was a guy by the name of Pedersen who put up a filter on top of Mauna Kea, Hawaii, and he measured the dust coming through. And he said, of all the dust coming through as cosmic dust, you would get 200 feet of dust on the surface of the moon if the moon were 4 billion plus years old. But he says, we know that all the dust is not cosmic dust. Most of it is recirculated terrestrial dust. And so what he called for in the paper was taking a satellite measurement of the amount of dust above the Earth's atmosphere. And when that was done, they were able to recalculate the amount of dust you would get on the moon if it's 4.5 billion years old. And the answer is it should be an average of 60 millimeters thick, which is exactly what the astronauts measured when they went to the moon.
Wow.
Just exactly that amount. The other thing was about the heat in the core of the Earth and the moon. And the argument was, well, if the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, it would have cooled down. Yes, it would have been hot in its interior, but it would have cooled down. Well, what they're overlooking is the amount of radiometric isotopes in the core of the Earth. It's much bigger than what we thought 50 years ago. And that radiometric decay of uranium and thorium and potassium is easily capable of explaining the heat flow that's coming out of the Earth, and likewise the heat flow that's coming out of the planet Mercury and the planet Moon. Did I cover the whole list?
Yeah, I think you did good.
Okay, all right.
How you doing? You doing all right? You got a
I'm
couple
doing
more?
fine.
Go all night. Here we go. This is about the flood. You mentioned the creation of continents. What do you say happened to the Earth's surface after Noah's flood?
Okay. People who believe that the flood of Noah was global rather than universal to all humanity. I mean, I was sharing with people this morning, the text you want to go to is 2 Peter 2 and 3, where it says of the flood, 2 Peter 2, it wiped out the world of the ungodly people. So it's the world of the ungodly that was destroyed, not the entire planet. And then 2 Peter 3 says cosmos tote was covered. Those two Hebrew-Greek words, cosmos tote means the world at the time the event took place. Peter was contrasting the world of Noah with the world of Rome. Both are less than the whole planet, but he's making the point the world of Noah is not the same as the world of Rome. And we have clear evidence that humanity had not yet inhabited Antarctica and Greenland at the time of Noah. Therefore, there's no need for God to flood Antarctica in order to wipe out the world of ungodly human beings. But those who take the view that the flood was global in extent also try to say that's when all the tectonic plate movement took place. And so as I've read their literature, they're saying before Noah's flood, there was a supercontinent, Pangaea. And then during the 5 months of the flood, it split apart and formed the 7 continents we have on the face of the earth today. Well, what they haven't taken into account is that requires about 7,000 to 8,000 horizontal miles of plate tectonic movement. And people who make these comments really haven't felt a good-sized earthquake. I'm from Southern California. We feel them quite frequently. In fact, I remember one time where we were right on top of an epicenter of a magnitude 6.1 earthquake, It moved our house by 2 inches and destroyed the furniture inside our bedroom. We actually saw this piece of furniture fly across the room and shatter on the opposite wall. But because of our housing standards, our townhouse was totally intact, no damage at all. We just had to replace the furniture. That was 2 inches. Multiply that up to 7,000 miles and squeeze it into a 5-month window. In fact, it is such that in order to generate that kind of energy, human beings would immediately incinerate and disappear. Likewise, all life. And the text tells us that didn't happen. In fact, the ark was floating on relatively tepid water. And so the continents we have today are exactly the same as the continents we had in the days before Noah, with very minor adjustments. Hawaii is a little bit bigger today than it was before the flood because volcanoes are continuing to erupt.
Last question. Can you give us a teaser for the 2 messages that you'll do tomorrow?
Okay, a teaser for the 2 messages tomorrow. Okay, the first message was going to be on what the animals teach us about the gospel of salvation. How God uses birds and mammals to teach us 5 critical spiritual lessons. And actually explains how it was that Job was able to discern the gospel message before any scripture was available to him, because he was in this intimate contact with birds and mammals. And explains why so many people today don't believe. I mean, what's interesting is that the rise of atheism correlates with the rise of urbanization. As people get cut off more and more from wild birds and wild mammals, atheism, belief in the fact that there is no God, rises. Whereas people who have that contact know that there must be a God. Matter of fact, if they have sufficient contact, they actually know the outline of the plan of salvation. So we're going to talk about that, and hopefully I'm going to encourage you to get outside once in a while and actually have contact with these animals. I've done that. I've gone to the wilds of Canada, where humans have never been in over 50 years, and you get to see how animals behave when they're not damaged by human sin. They want relationship with us. I was amazed at how these wild animals would first observe me, and then they would come towards me and they wanted contact with me. I remember waking up in my pup tent one morning and they're right there inside the pup tent, wanting that kind of contact. And I can tell you other stories. I had a cousin who was in a small rowboat out in the Georgia Strait, and this 50-foot gray whale came up right beside his rowboat. He thought he was going to get capsized. But the whale was very gentle, did not capsize it. And as soon as my cousin began to stroke the back of the whale, it was very calm. Then suddenly the whale disappeared. 5 minutes later, it came back with its calf and pushed the calf up so the calf could get that kind of contact.
Wow.
Anyway, I got a few more stories I'll tell you tomorrow. Okay. The second talk is going to be called Cosmic Reasons to Believe in Christ. And it's basically a talk I developed because I'm involved in this atheist video dialogue where atheists around the world will engage me via video. And there's this woman in Ireland who said, I've read one of your books. I understand how you use science to prove that there's a God. But how do you use science to go from God to deism, deism to theism, and theism to Jesus Christ without reference to the Bible, just using science? And I said, there are 3 ways that I know that I can explain it to you quickly. I gave her all 3 ways. Tomorrow, my last talk, I'm going to give you one of those 3 ways. How you can use what we see in the universe to show not only must there be a God, but it must be the Redeemer God, Jesus Christ of the Bible. How we can use cosmology to establish that Jesus Christ indeed is our advocate and our Redeemer. And so, plan of salvation through the animals, the plan of salvation through the stars and the galaxies. That's tomorrow. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Paul.